Today, we're going to talk about one of the most decisive and yet one of the most forgotten stories of the Second World War, the incredible role the Indian Army played in the campaigns across Africa. And just to get a sense of the scale here, you have to start with this number. By 1945, the British Indian Army had grown to over 2.5 million men. It was, and it still is, the largest all-volunteer army in the history of warfare. And look, their impact wasn't just about sheer numbers. This quote here from Field Marshal Auchinleck, the Army's own commander-in-chief, says it all. He's not saying they were helpful. He's saying Britain literally couldn't have survived without them. Which, of course, raises a pretty big question. Why is a contribution that significant so often just left out of the history books? That's the question we're going to dig into today, as we follow their journey from the mountains of Eritrea all the way to the deserts of Egypt. So the whole story really kicks off with a paradox. At the start of the war, the Indian Army was, for all intents and purposes, a small colonial constabulary. It was designed for policing frontiers, not fighting a modern, mechanized war. But then Italy joins the war, and suddenly this force is tasked with defending the absolute lifeline of the British Empire, the Suez Canal. Their first major test, that came in East Africa, and it was a huge one. They were up against a massive Italian army. We're talking nearly 300,000 soldiers. That was threatening the entire Red Sea region. The strategic problem they faced was immense. You have the Italian army dug into what was basically a fortress of granite peaks. So what was the solution sent from the Raj? Two of their best infantry formations, the 4th and 5th Indian Divisions, also known as the Red Eagles and the Ball of Fire. And this is where something that seemed like a weakness became their greatest strength. In an age of tanks and trucks, the Indian Army's supposedly old-fashioned reliance on mule companies was the only way to get supplies to troops fighting on vertical cliffs. These animals and the men who handled them became the absolute lifeline of the campaign. And believe me, they needed every advantage they could get at the Battle of Keren. For 53 straight days, Indian and British soldiers launched assault after assault, straight-up sheer rock faces, against some of Italy's best mountain troops. It was just a brutal, grinding battle where every single inch of ground was paid for in blood. The kind of courage shown there is, well, it's hard to wrap your head around. These were the last words of Subedar Richpal Ram. After he was mortally wounded, he just kept waving his men forward to take the objective. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honor there is, and his story was just one of many. Now, after that stunning, hard-won victory in East Africa, the whole war shifts to a completely different landscape, the wide-open deserts of North Africa. And here, the enemy was new and he was formidable, Erwin Rommel and his legendary Afrika Korps. You know, the Desert War was just this wild, seesaw battle, constantly back and forth. Indian units were there right from the beginning, winning huge victories like in Operation Compass. But they also made these incredible sacrifices, like the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade at Mekelle, which was basically wiped out just to buy time for the rest of the army to escape. They suffered terrible defeats too. But their most critical moment, that came in July of 1942. This was the breaking point. The entire British 8th Army was about to collapse at El Alamein, and holding the line on a place called Ruisat Ridge was the 18th Indian Brigade. They were armed with these tiny, totally obsolete anti-tank guns against German panzers. They fought to the last man and were almost completely destroyed, but they stopped Rommel's final push. They saved Egypt. All right, so now we get to the final act of the war in Africa, and it all goes down in Tunisia. As the Allies closed in, the terrain changed again. The flat desert turned into rugged mountains. And it was right here that the unique skills of the Indian Army would be the deciding factor again. So here's the final problem the Allies faced. The Germans were dug into a formidable defensive line, anchored on these steep, rocky peaks. Allied tanks? Completely useless here. The whole advance had just ground to a halt. How in the world were they supposed to break through? Well, the answer came from the commander of the 4th Indian Division, and it was brilliant. He proposed a silent infiltration. At night, Gurkha soldiers, who are just masters of mountain warfare, scaled the sheer cliffs, using their famous kukri knives to, quietly take out the sentries. They seized the high ground before the main battle even started, completely breaking the German line. And this all builds to what is just one of the most powerful, symbolic moments of the entire war. On May 12, 1943, the commander of all Axis forces in Africa, General von Arnim, surrenders. But he doesn't surrender to the Americans or to the main British force. He surrenders to the soldiers of the 4th Indian Division. But, just talking about battles and victories, that's really only half the story. To really understand these soldiers, you have to look at the incredibly complex world they were living in and the paradoxes they faced every single day. I mean, just try to imagine this for a second. These men were volunteers, fighting for the British Empire at the exact same time that empire was suppressing the Quit India movement for independence back home. In their letters, which they knew were being censored, they came up with codes like black pepper for Indian troops and red pepper for British troops, so they could talk about who was really doing the fighting. For them, the motivation wasn't the empire, it was a powerful code of honor called Is It. It was about loyalty to your unit and the guys fighting next to you, a bond that created this deep respect with soldiers like the Australians they fought alongside in Tobruk. And that commitment, that sense of honor, it came at a staggering price. Across East and North Africa, more than 22,000 Indian soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. An absolutely immense human cost for victories so far from their homes. Which brings us right back to where we started, with Auchinleck's words. And you realize, it's not an exaggeration, it's a statement of strategic reality. From the cliffs of Keren to the ridges of Al Alamein, the Indian Army's contribution wasn't just helpful, it was foundational. So you have this incredible story of courage and complexity, a story that was absolutely decisive for the Allied victory. And yet, it's a story most of us have never heard. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other huge foundational stories of our shared history are just out there, waiting for us to remember them?